Hello and welcome to the Outdoorsy Educator podcast, where stories become lessons and every journey has something to teach us. Every week I sit down with people from all walks of life to hear their adventures, explore their experiences, and uncover the insights that have shaped them along the way. Whether it's from the outdoors, the classroom, or any other path, each conversation offers a fresh perspective on learning, growth, and what it means to truly connect with the world and the people around us. And on this week's episode of the Outdoorsy Educator, I am joined by Daria Dato. Daria, how are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm in North Carolina and it's beautiful here.
Yes, I believe you are a fellow Texas resident. You're actually pretty close to where I live, but I'm rather envious. North Carolina, a beautiful state, especially at this time of year, I
Gorgeous.
imagine.
It's gorgeous. I just
Yeah.
arrived last night, so I haven't spent a full day here yet, but it is absolutely beautiful in North Carolina. I have loved it since I was a kid.
Yeah, I've not spent a lot of time there. I've driven through it several times. Recently, about a year or two ago, I was in Damascus, Virginia, for trail days, actually, which we'll get into
Oh,
hiking in
fun.
the outdoors. But spent a little time in Charlotte and driving around in North Carolina. But why don't you tell our
Wonderful.
audience a little bit about who you are, about yourself?
All right. I am a clinical social worker. Been doing that since I went back to school as a grown up in my early 30s after raising my daughter. She started to get ready to go to college, and I thought, uh-oh, if I don't go back, I'm not going to beat her out of college. So I
Right.
better hurry. So I started back to school when she was a junior, I think, in high school. And so been a wonderful career. I love working in this field because you get to help people all day, which is amazing. It's just a wonderful thing to do, and the skill set that you get out of the education helps so much in your own life with problem solving and triaging and figuring out things. And if something comes up unexpected, you have the tools to figure out how to deal with it. And so really a wonderful path that I kind of stumbled upon, but here I am, and I'm mostly am able to work remote since
Ah,
COVID happened. I do a
mhm.
lot of telehealth, and so since I can do telehealth, I can take my show on the road, and so I have traveled a lot more starting in 2020.
I love that. And I had a quick look at your bio before we got on this call. I try not to do too much research because I like to hear from the individual, but I believe you are a fellow Texas Women's University graduate like myself.
Yes, I am
Yeah.
alumni. I have a couple of degrees from there. Well, three, I guess, actually. And then my master's in social work, though, came from UTA. TWU does
Oh,
offer an MSW program now, but they did not at the time that I went through. So I got my BSW at Texas Women's.
I
And then I
love
have an
that.
MBA and a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from TWU. And I taught at TWU for a couple of years, from 2006 to 2008. I was at first an adjunct and then a visiting professor while they were looking for somebody permanent to take the position in the social work department. So I got to teach a bunch of social work classes, which was really cool.
I love that. We immediately have a lot in common. I'm also a triple alum now of TWU. I've
Oh, wow.
adjunct there. I was a visiting professor and now working my way into a tenure track
Oh,
assistant role there. So yeah,
oh, that's wonderful.
it's a very important place in my life, Texas Women's University.
It is a
Um,
wonderful school.
so I love that. A fellow pioneer. Well, one of the reasons
Yes.
I'm particularly excited to talk to you today is we both share, as many of our listeners will, an affection and a love for the outdoors. But before we get sort of into nature and things like that, you're traveling. Where has that taken you to? What have been the highlights of, as you said, taking your show on the road?
Well, this trip, I just got started a few days ago. I left on Friday morning. I went to Atlanta. Well, stopped in Little Rock briefly, but then went to Atlanta to see some relatives for a couple of days. and then made my way here yesterday. So I'm just getting started, but I'll be here for 2 months. As we discussed, I'll be babysitting a few chickens and a cat and
Yes.
house sitting for my friends here. And that's going to give me an opportunity to do a lot of exploring around North Carolina. I'm about an hour east of Asheville. So I'll be spending some time over there and in Boone. And I want to go to Winston-Salem. I've got play tickets next month in somewhere near Charlotte, I think. So I'll be out that way. And so I'm going to just do, some looking around and exploring. And of course, hiking. I haven't even pulled up, which trails. And I've done some before with these friends of mine that are here. But I'm going to find some more trails to get out on. And my dogs will love to do that kind of thing. So I'll be here for a couple of months. And then I'm heading up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I'm actually buying some land up there,
Ah.
and so I will have that land by then. And so I'm going to go up and spend 6 weeks kind of Robinson Crusoeing it up there. Not quite totally roughing it because the land is somewhat improved already, but working with a contractor to figure out what we're going to do with it in coming years. And it's a unique and interesting opportunity. So I'm super excited about that. And I'll be doing a lot of hiking up there. So lots of hiking on my agenda the next few months.
Wonderful. Well, a couple of quick thoughts. Boone, I drove through Boone, North Carolina, 2 years ago, I think, on my way to the Appalachian Trail Days Festival. Man alive, that's a beautiful
Uh,
drive and a lovely town.
mhm. It is
It
fabulous.
really, really was something special. And at some point, we're going to have to chit chat more. I've got visions and dreams of buying some land up north, for the future where the weather's a little cooler. Um,
Yes.
so that's I'm quite envious.
Happy to speak with you
Yes,
or anybody about that. I
yes,
love real estate. I come from a real estate family, and I had a real estate license a long time ago that I never really used. But I know markets across the country somewhat well because I'm just a completely rabid reader, which is I think the next step beyond avid reader, maybe two or three steps
yes.
beyond. And so I will read anything that doesn't eat me first.
I
So
love it. I love it. Well, we will talk. We will talk land and all of that at some point soon because that's
I'm happy to
uh
do so. I enjoy these things.
fascinating. I'd like to sort of dive into your social work a little bit, and how that relates to the outdoors. Sort of in your experience as a social worker, what role can the outdoors play in healing, whether that's emotional, mental, or even physical? How do those two worlds come together?
It really does seem to help people when they get up and get out. It's not for everybody. I found there are some people who just, they're closed to the idea of getting outside. And then sometimes, though, and starting with COVID, when we couldn't be inside, I started doing some walk and talks with people that really wanted to meet in person. And, there was that year or so period where you really didn't want to meet anybody
Hmm.
indoors. And so when people really wanted to meet in person, then we would do some walk and talks. And then a few years ago, I put together a little, along with it, she was an LMSW who was working on her hours, her supervision hours. And so together we put together it was maybe a 3 session um, kind of hike and talk for young adults who were trying to figure out what they were going to do next in life. They had finished high school, but they weren't really sure what the next steps were. And so we had three, I think, that joined us that were maybe 18 to 22 or so, and we picked different places, mostly around Denton, that we went and hiked and talked and just explored what options might look like. And so that's when you're outdoors and you're talking about your problems, they step into perspective, I think, a little better. And in terms of the bigness of them, it retreats a little bit. You're out with trees and lakes and, it's pretty. And so things seem more manageable somehow, and ideas seem more possible, and things that you maybe thought you couldn't have accomplished. Maybe your mind is a little more open when you're talking about them while you're walking.
I love that. I interviewed a lady called Amy Fraser who lives in Portland last year, And now I believe she is a licensed therapist. I don't want to get my terms muddied here, but she spoke of very similar things. She now does hiking therapy, where she takes, and of course it's a choice. People can come into the office, a traditional setting, or they can go for quarter mile, half mile, 1 mile walks, depending on the length of the session. And she spoke a lot about the metaphors in nature and how she can use those to help people relate to the issues that they're having and work through them. Just watching nature become more dormant in the winter and then a rebirth, things like that. So it sounds like even though it's slightly different fields, very similar experiences in the outdoors.
Yeah, once we get the degree, especially the counseling degrees, we do very similar things with them
Hmm.
after, and we can do the same things. We just do them under a different license and with a slightly different ethical code and a slightly different perspective. And so, social work, we like to look at people from the biopsychosocial perspective. And so, we're looking at the fact that, of course, we all have our biology that we come with, our genetics, and what our current physical situation is, whether it's age or health or what it might be. But we also have a psychological perspective, which
Hmm.
has to do with our personality and also our early experiences, the things that really shaped us and formed us. And that can include trauma, of course. And then the social aspect, which is the environmental piece. And that's kind of everything else. Who are your friends? Where are you living? How do you get to work? What kind of work do you do? What kind of education do you have? Do you need more education? Do you need a way to get to work? Is there somebody watching the children while you're trying to figure out going to work, and things like that. And so biopsychosocial perspective. And then the other thing that social workers, we kind of hang our hat on, a core tenet for us, is the client's right to self-determination.
Mm.
That people are the experts on themselves, and they ultimately will be able to make a decision that is best for them. And so it's a little different from some of the other fields in that we don't claim to be the expert. We claim to be walking alongside and helping to maybe explore different perspectives, to maybe think about possible outcomes that somebody, who isn't trained to think 3 steps down the chessboard, maybe, they might need some help with that, or they might need some help looking at, what a negative consequence might be of a particular decision. But ultimately, we're very respectful of people's ability to know themselves and to make the decision that is best for them.
Right, I love that. Yeah, you're not so much telling people you need to go from A to B to C to D. You're helping guide them. And I think you maybe said this one, it sort of empowers people to make these decisions, but you're there to steer and guide and help them look down the path. I love that. I love that because yeah, you're not removing the power from the individual. Um,
Yes. The other thing that's important to
yes.
social workers, I think, if I can throw
Hmm.
one more thing in, is we
Please.
look at things from the strengths perspective. And so when I meet somebody and I am first doing an assessment and getting to know them, I'm tallying their internal strengths and their external strengths. Do they have resilience? Do they have a sunny attitude? Are they very tenacious? Stubbornness can be a very positive uh, thing for people, that they are going to be able to stick with something. You might need to get around a little hard-headedness to help open their mind to various ideas, but that they're probably, once they get on board with an idea, they're probably going to stick it out. And so we look at those strengths, and then we look at areas of concern, and we try to figure out how can we use these strengths, internal strengths and external strengths. Like, maybe they have a house, or they have a car, or they have a supportive family member who's willing to help with education, or those are external strengths. And so how do we use these strengths to address these areas of concern and to overcome them so that a client can live what they want as their best life? How can they get to where they are going to be winning? And so that's what makes social work so fun is, we start out with somebody who might be really struggling and not able to see any possibility. And as humans, we're very hard on ourselves. We
Hmm.
internalize our failures. I did that, and we externalize our successes. I'm only succeeding at something because of so and so that has nothing to do with me. And so helping people kind of adjust their lens about those things and seeing, that amount of hard work and effort they put into the things that they have succeeded at, and how, maybe some of the things that they look at as failures, there were other things besides just
Hmm.
their own inadequacies that contributed to those. And so then we can use all of that to kind of spur them into action, to use the strengths to make a life that is meaningful.
I love that. I think I can safely say the world of social work and education, which is my bread and butter, they're not
Closely
mutually
related.
exclusive. Yeah, there's some definite crossover there, and a trend I've noticed over the last decade or so, a good thing, is that when a lot of teachers enter the profession, they're often asked to do a strength finders assessment, which I'm sure is something you are familiar with, and just trying to generate the good habits of focusing on the strengths of the individual and not what they can't or are, not a strength. I don't say what they can't do, but here's where the strengths are and how can we utilize those to help that individual become the best, happiest, most satisfied teacher they can be. It's a very good thing that has happened. Because I know I've got things that I need to work on and struggle with, but I can now say I've also got strengths in certain areas, and try to build my career on those rather than focusing on I need to get better at this and better at that, because there's always going to be things that I need to improve. So why not just try and celebrate the things that I have managed to achieve and build on top of those? So yeah, some definite parallels, I think, between our
Yeah.
worlds.
Well, and also connecting to hiking, being in the moment that you're in. When we're worrying about the future or we're ruminating on things that have happened in the past, we can't really enjoy this moment. And
Oh,
so being
indeed.
able to be fully present and to live life as it happens rather than in the past or in the future. That's quite a skill. I'm still working on that one myself. So,
Absolutely. I had that
so it really helps.
conversation, a very similar conversation with the author Savannah Shuring about a month ago. She's written a wonderful book about the AT. I'll recommend it to you
Oh,
after
cool.
we're finished.
Oh, yes, I would love
She
to.
she through hiked the AT, but for her, and I may get some of the details wrong here, so I apologize to Savannah, but I think it was for her master's dissertation. She interviewed hikers about the why. Why are you on the trails? She wasn't asking about gear or miles or this or that. It was what is your purpose being out here? What drove you to be out here? And it's a book basically full of short stories. But what we talked about was even
Wonderful.
getting out in nature, even going for, let's say, a 3 mile hike. You can be walking on the trail and still thinking, I need to get finished, I need to get back, I need to do this. So we discussed taking a 5 minute break halfway through that, where you literally make yourself just turn all that off for 5 minutes and just turn off the podcast, turn off the music, put the phone down, and just 5 minutes of nothing. Because we both found some common ground with, yeah, we can go for a hike, but we didn't mentally put ourselves in a place to get everything we could from it because the world is all consuming and work and life can be so busy.
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds like something you could relate to in that way.
Oh, certainly. Yes. It's wonderful getting outside and just being there in the day. And emptying your mind as much as possible. I'm a big thinker. I'm sure you probably are
Yeah,
too. My
yes.
brain is always working overtime, but it does slow a little when I'm out, and you have to pay attention if you bring dogs like I do, or your surroundings in general. Where are you
Hmm.
putting your feet, and what's ahead on the trail, and how much time do you have before it gets dark, or you need to turn around, or there's problem solving that goes on. So
Absolutely. Yeah, you can't turn completely off. Indeed, that wouldn't be it wouldn't be safe. But we've talked a lot about your enjoyment of the outdoors, but if you wouldn't mind taking us back, where did this start? Is this something as a child you were encouraged to do and did, or did it come to you slightly later in life?
So a little bit when I was a child. My parents divorced when I was little, and my father, when we would spend weekends with him, he would sometimes take us out on bike trails, or he had a boat, and we would go out on the boat and be outdoors, and sometimes camp overnight on an island on Lake Texoma or something. And so that gave me a taste of it. My mother was very not into those kinds of things, and so most of the time when I was with my mother, I didn't have any of those kinds of experiences. And as a lot of us social workers do, I came through a relatively difficult childhood experience. And so when I was 15, I was kind of in and out of placements. And one of the
Mm.
places I spent several months was wilderness camp. And I
Ah.
lived outdoors for a few months in this wilderness camp setting. And so I think that was what really introduced me to the outdoors. And I went in professing to hate it. And, I didn't want to do this. And, I was kind of an oppositional, defiant teenager, as somebody who was raised as I was would be. And so I didn't fully embrace or enjoy it, but it definitely gave me some skills and gave me some exposure and helped me understand a little better about how these things work. And then didn't crop up very much again, other than I was a bike rider, still am a little bit, and an inline skater because I ice skated as a kid. So I was
Mm.
inline skating and street skating. And so that took me outside. I started that around 2004, I guess, so about 20 years ago, doing a lot of street skating with a group in Dallas. And that kind of reintroduced me a little bit to the idea of, just being outside and doing things outside. And then I bought this little house near Denton in Shady
Hmm.
Shores, and it was out in the
Yes.
woods by the lake. And there were woods right there, and I knew there were, and I was kind of scared to go out in them by myself. And so I posted an ad on Craigslist. This would have been in the fall of 2007, maybe early 2008. And I said, "Is there anybody that lives around Shady Shores that would want to go hiking in these woods around my house that I'm scared to go into on my own?" And
Right.
one person responded, and it turns out he was in the movie Born on the Fourth of July, and he was the guy
Ah.
that Tom Cruise killed. Michael Gully, and usually I can remember his last name. I must be a little nervous. I can't think of it right now. But Compataro, Mike Compataro. And so he also lived in Shady Shores at the time, and he responded to my ad, and he said I would be up for going out in the woods. And so we went out in the woods several times and went walking around. He told me the whole story about how he came to be selected to be in Born on the Fourth of July, and how he ended up. I
Wow.
mean, he was kind of the co-star, but of course he got killed and written out very early. And then there was a child version of him because I guess the movie did flashbacks. I've never seen the movie, but the movie did flashbacks to their childhood because Tom Cruise and Mike's role, they were best friends growing up. So there were
Wow.
flashbacks to their childhood together before they ended up in Vietnam, and Mike's role, Mike's character got killed. Um, but I got to hear that whole story, and I was teaching at TWU at the time, and so we talked about that, and I was still taking more classes and learning more things, and we talked about that, and the time would just speed by.
Mm.
We'd go for these miles long walks, and it seemed like just moments when hours would pass, and that really kind of awakened me. And then I'm a voracious reader, as I mentioned. And so, somewhere along the way, I found a list of apps that told you about where hikes were. And
Hmm.
so, I downloaded one of these apps and I started noticing, oh my gosh, there are so many hikes, even around the Denton area, that I had no idea were there. And so that got me more interested in local hiking. And then in my travels, I was able to discover some really amazing trails that I never would have found, and that got me really interested. And I even did a little bit of backpacking. I haven't done that in a few years. I'm hoping I'm still young enough that I'll do some backpacking again. But I discovered Eagle Rock Loop in Arkansas, which is like
Yep.
a 3 day. hike that you park somewhere and then you just go around the loop. And there's lots of stream crossings, and you have to be very careful about if there's recent rains. Well, one or two of those crossings at least can be quite dangerous, and so you have to really be aware of what's going on with the water and the weather in on Eagle Rock Loop. And then I was started training for a hike on the island of Kauai. I was on Kauai and I
Mm,
found out about the Kalalau Trail, which is considered one of the 10 most extreme hikes in the world, and dangerous. It's a dangerous hike, and it requires quite a bit of technical ability. And so I only did the first 2 miles of it when I stumbled upon it when I was on Kauai, but I immediately vowed the next time I went to Kauai, I would do more of it. And so to prepare for that, that was when I started doing Eagle Rock Loop. And then I also was in Colorado and I found Fancy Lake and the Missouri Lakes. There's two trails that go up mountains, and the parking lots are just 500 feet from each other. And so you can start at the bottom of one, go up, and then you go through the pass. It's called Fancy Pass, and it's quite difficult to make it through that pass. But then you can go down on the other side and you end up in the other parking lot, but you're literally 2 more minutes walking to get to your car. And
right.
so it's a beautiful way to train for climbing mountains and gaining a lot of elevation and things like that. And so that's the app helped me discover that particular hike, and I've now done that one several times, including one overnight, which was quite memorable because a storm blew in and we were camped above the tree line, and that's the coldest I've ever been in my life, and possibly the closest to death. I mean, it was
Right.
it was a rough, uncomfortable night, but you survive these kinds of things, and not only do you learn skills, but you also gain confidence, and you know that you can get yourself through things, and you learn about preparation for next time, so you don't end up in a storm above the tree line by accident.
Absolutely. And I do
So,
think you're right. These lessons, stay with you. I've gone lost on trails a couple of times. One particularly memorable was I stumbled into where they had done a prescribed burn and all the trail markers had gone.
oh no.
I saw there was a prescribed burn, and the short story is I saw somebody coming the other way, and he said, "Oh, it's fine. It's actually fine. The trail is really untouched. No problem at all." I got several miles in and realized that that really wasn't the case at all, and there was still lots of smoldering trees, and it was really quite hot and getting late, and I'd lost the trail completely in the Sam Houston Forest. It was the
Oh
Lone
my
Star
goodness.
Trail. Um, Long story short, I had to having to go through the woods. Thankfully, I had one bar's reception and saw that there was a small county road
Mm.
several hundred yards through the forest. So kind of stumbled through the forest, got out to the county road, and of all things, I said this would be a short story. Um, a local sheriff, happened to be coming down the road, was very skeptical, we'll say that, about what I was doing out there, because they had discovered some land where people were hiding stolen travel trailers. And so there
Oh
was
wow.
there was guns drawn, there was all sorts. They ended up giving me
That's quite a hiking adventure. You
it
don't sign up
was
for all that when you go hiking.
no, not at all. They couldn't have been nicer in the end once they established I was nothing to do with that, and actually gave me a ride
Wow.
to the campsite that I was aiming for. Couldn't have been nicer,
Other
gentlemen.
other than the guns drawn, your story
Yeah,
brings to mind when I go to do the Kalalau Trail, I usually
yes.
a couple days before I take on the Kalalau, I do the Hanakapiai, which takes you 2 miles down the Kalalau, but then you go up and you climb up to this beautiful waterfall. And there was a day, it's been, I don't know, close to 10 years ago, but my hiking partner and I were dropped off very early in the morning at the trailhead, which is near Ka Beach,
Hmm.
at the end of the trail or the end of the road on Kauai, if you go all the way around on the north side. And there was a little bit of caution tape that was like laying on the ground, but we just walked over it and continued on and went all the way up to the waterfall. And when we got up there, there were a couple of other couples or maybe one small group up there, and they were leaving pretty shortly after we got there, and we were the last ones to leave. And as we were coming down, only one more couple came up, heading towards the falls. And it seemed unusual compared to previous visits where you see a lot of people on the trails because this is a highly touristed part of Kauai.
Yeah.
And the people asked, how much further to the waterfall, and we told them. And so then we kept going down. And as we got down to Hanakapiai Beach, which is where you turn and you have 2 more miles to get out on the Kalalau, there was a park ranger waiting. And he said, "Is there anyone else behind you?" And we said, "Well, there's this one couple that we passed. They were still heading
Right.
up to the falls." And he said, "How long ago did you see them?" And, kind of tried to establish exactly where they might be. And then he said, "There's a fire." There were some Hawaiians doing a ceremony, a traditional
Mhm.
ceremony. And as part of that, they throw flaming torches into the water. And apparently, one didn't make it into the water, and it started a fire on a ridge, and it was moving in towards the trail. And so they had closed the trail, and they were trying to make sure everybody was off of it.
Goodness.
And as we continued this 2 miles, I mean, and it's a very difficult 2 miles. It, sounds like, oh, 2 miles, you'll be out in an hour, but it is quite an arduous up and down, and it's very humid. And as we kept progressing along these 2 miles, it got smokier and smokier. And we saw the helicopters with these big baskets, and they were going down into the ocean, and the basket was scooping up water, and then they were flying off to go dump it on the fire. And there were two helicopters that just kept going back and forth and this smoke. And then we got to the park, and normally there are people there and cars. And there was nothing. We had to just walk out only to catch a ride from somebody at that point to go a little further down the
Mm-hmm.
road because there's no cell service. So you try to get to where there's cell service so you can call your friend to come pick you up or whatever. And there was nobody to hitch a ride with. And so we just were walking along the road, and an ember actually burned my friend's shirt and burned a hole in it. And,
Goodness.
finally we got through and past the smoky part and to where there were cars. And then we were able to hitch a ride and get the rest of the way away. But turns out that caution tape, I guess they had put it up, but somebody had broken it and laid it on the ground before we got there. So we didn't realize that it meant the trail was closed. So we spent the whole day on a closed trail quite by accident.
Goodness. We have very similar experience. With retrospect, I think there was a barrier up, but it had blown down and was face down. So I
Mm-hmm.
didn't think anything of it. With hindsight, I should have thought about it. But yes, the caution tape could have saved that could have saved the day if you had seen it. As we kind of come round to the end of this interview, I've got three questions I would love to ask you. Again, kind of thinking about social work and the outdoors, how has your definition of success changed throughout the years, if indeed it has?
Mm. Oh, wow. I live so much in the moment. It is hard to even think back to what my definition of success was a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
But it definitely has changed and continues to change. If you had told me 10 or 20 years ago that I would be seriously buying a small campground in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and looking at spending my summers there, I would have told you you were crazy. And now this is the thing that I am just the most excited about. This is going to be such a wonderful adventure these next 10 years or so. So to me, I think now today, success is more on being content moment by moment by
Mm-hmm.
moment. And I love compounded wins. I like to say that social workers love win-wins. And I love wins that compound upon themselves. My father was a very successful businessman, and I think money was far more important to him than maybe it should have been in terms of priorities. But he did like to talk about compounded interest, and he liked the idea of his money earning money without him having to do anything for it. And I think about that, but in terms of experiences and interactions with others. How can we all win and continue to win and build on these wins and with without having to work really hard against the land or the place that we are or the time that we're in. How can we flow with it and roll with it, but make it successful in all ways?
I love that. I've never really thought about compounded interest outside of money. That's a lovely analogy and one that I'll carry with me. Yeah, whether
Wonderful.
it's work or friendships or family, I love the thought of that. I'm going to be thinking about that today. Something else I did want to ask you. You mentioned before how much you love to read. There may be more than one, but might be the first one that comes to mind? A book that has been particularly impactful on your life.
Hmm. Wow, a book that has been particularly impactful on my life.
Yeah, always makes my guests pause. That one. Yes.
One that comes to mind, and it's an odd one. It's from 20 or so years ago. House of Leaves.
Okay, I've never heard of House of Leaves.
It was written by there's a singer Poe, and it was her brother. I think his name is Daniel. I can't remember his last name. And she wrote a soundtrack that accompanied it. But it was basically, and I think what I loved so much about it was a very difficult read. But what I loved so much about it is it opened my mind to possibilities that had never occurred to me before. And it's basically a book about a house that was slightly larger on the inside than it was on the outside. And it turned
Interesting.
out there was a cave that was inside of a closet. And then it was what happened in that cave and how that cave was explored and discovered. And it's one of those a little bit choose your own adventure books where
Hmm.
certain things you have to flip to other pages and you have to it's a hard read, but it was a fascinating idea, and that somebody was out writing something like that and thinking like that. And this was at the time that I was just starting to get my education, and so my mind was being opened to so many different possibilities, so many different ways. And so that one I think was a big game changer. And I'll tell you, in honor
Hmm.
of hiking, I have to throw in one more. There's a book, it was a fiction book, maybe from 25 or 30 years ago, even called The Bear Went Over the Mountain. And it was about a bear who was in the woods. I think he was in the Maine woods. And he stumbled across a manuscript that a writer had left. It was in a briefcase. And if I recall right, the writer was disgusted by the manuscript and he finally just tossed it in the bushes and left. And the bear found it and read it and thought it was relatively good and felt like he could probably do something with it. And so he brought it to Manhattan and became an
Right.
overnight author sensation. That he only spoke in grunts, and he was kind of a big guy in a secondhand suit, and people knew him as this hairy, quiet, weird author. But he became very successful, and that was another one I loved because it was so whimsical, and it involved being in the outdoors and writing, and it had a lot of components of things I really like. So.
That's tremendously interesting. I'm going to have to look that up. Speaking of being in the outdoors, I do like to ask my guests if you could go hiking for a day with anybody in the world. This could be somebody you know, somebody you don't, famous, not famous, somebody from history, dead, alive, anybody. You could go for a day hike on the AT there in beautiful North Carolina for a day and pick their brains, ask them anything. Who do you think you would like to go hiking with?
Barack Obama.
That not the first guest to say that. I think that's a great answer. And if you wouldn't mind elaborating a little bit as to why.
Because of the way things were and the animosity and the anger and the fighting against him, he didn't get the chance, I feel like, to do the things that he could have done and that he tried to do.
Hmm.
And I feel like he had such a sense of needing to not make any mistakes and to set an absolute example and to prove that as an African American and person of color, he was up to this task of leading this great nation. And he also was so collaborative. And I see in him a lot of things that I see in myself. And, so much of what he did, it's got to be so hard for him to see like what's happening today, for example. And I would love to listen to him talk and to just hear the things that he thinks about, what all has happened and what he wanted to do and how things could be, or what he thinks is going to happen from now. And I feel like that's just a marvelously untapped resource in this country, that we were given something that could have been so amazing. And part of it was the machine too, that
Oh,
he was a
yes.
neophyte. And there were, even within his own party, obviously, career politicians that wanted to use anything they could to manipulate themselves to a better place. And so, so many just crazy things moved into place during that time. And I would love to spend a day out in the world with him, hearing him talk about himself and his life, and what has become of all of this and what happened back then. And I don't know, it would just be so fascinating. And I would tell Michelle I don't have any designs on her husband. I just want to, hear what he has to say. And
Right.
she could come along. It would be wonderful to have her there too.
There you go. That they could both come on the hike. Yes,
Yes,
it was
you said
she.
one person, but I would love to have them both.
I think that's a lovely, lovely thing. Well, I cannot thank you enough, Daria. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you so much for joining me this week on this episode of the Outdoorsy Educator podcast.
Thank you so much, Alasdair.
Thank you again to this week's guest, and I hope today's episode was as enjoyable for you as it was for me, and perhaps even inspired your next adventure. If you did enjoy the show, please be sure to subscribe, leave a review, or follow us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find more information at theoutdoorseyeducator.com or follow us on Instagram, TikTok, or Facebook. Until next time, thank you so much for listening to the Outdoorsy Educator podcast.